Hi guys, Niklaus Bauer here. Today we are doing a UV resin school when it comes to heads on pike flies, and also we are going to show you a small little jig fly here also. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the evolution of gluing ice, in my opinion, to big pike flies or whatever big flies in general. You know, we used to work a lot with epoxy before. We used to put it in warm water to get the bubbles out and all that stuff. I basically don't even use epoxy other than to glue like a popper head onto the hook. And there's a lot of things what has happened the last few years. First of all, the UV resin has become extremely good. They are completely tack-free. You can have different viscosities, so you can have a thin man, you can have a classic or a fat man, or even a flex man, different variations of these. And of course you have all the variations of really cool colors that are available nowadays. So I think the way to go is nowadays UV resin. And if you look to the fly tying scene, it has been a huge market change and what people can create with these UV resins today. I mean, there are some guys out there that are insane what they do with UV resins. They do everything from crabs to different shades of baitfish with glitter and stuff like that. So it's really cool to see, and it's much better, most likely for yourself also when you're working with this, because epoxy is really dangerous for you. The fumes that they are not healthy at all. Most of the UV resins are much more environmentally safe and also much better, more safe for you. So it's a really good product. There's a few things I think you should really kind of understand when it comes to UV resin if you haven't used them before. They have an expire date. They don't last forever, because the clear ones, they get old after 2 to 3 years, depending on the viscosity. And the color ones, they don't last as long, because the color pigment that are mixed into the UV resins, it becomes more, they don't become hard, but they become not as lightly fluent as they are straight from the factory. So in a lot of the balls that are sold nowadays, definitely in the Gulf range, and I think a lot of other brands are going to put that, there will be a best before date. So you have to take that under consideration when you buy this, because they will become more and more thick in the appearance of them. You know, if you buy like a red or an orange one after 2 to 3 years, you will not be able to push it through that tin tip anymore. You know, you need to unscrew it and dip your dubbing needle into it or something like that. But it's still going to work for a few extra years. So just remember that when you buy UV resins. Otherwise, there's two things that I think that's very important. Have a good UV lamp. What is important with that is buy one that are chargeable. Don't buy the ones that have separate batteries inside of it, because you need to have this very well charged and also always fresh batteries inside, because to get the best result when you're curing the UV resin, you need to have as fresh batteries as possible, and they take a lot of batteries. So buy one that are rechargeable and has a rechargeable battery inside. That's my tip. The other one is that store the bottle upside down. When you're storing the bottle like this, they will, standing like this on the table, they will contract air inside the bottle. So every time you flip this around and you start to push out the UV resin, you will start out with some bubbles, which is going to be quite annoying. So always store the bottles when you're using them, at least. You don't have to do it all the time, but when you're using them, store them like this, because it becomes, when you push this straight out, you get bubble-free UV resin, which is, I think is really good. A lot of the brands nowadays also have this micro tips that are included in the box, which is really good when you want to work in tight spaces and stuff like that. So what we're going to do now, we're going to do 3 different heads here. We're going to do one head of a pike fly that is going to be hard, stone hard. So we're going to use Thin Man and Classic, which are both viscosities that become very hard. We're going to use the Thin Man as a foundation, so we get the resin into the material, and then we're going to build up the bulk with the Classic. There's also a even fatter one, what's called a Fat Man, if you want to make really big heads. But we're going to we're gonna focus on the two lighter versions. And then we're gonna do a pike fly where we're not gonna use a hard resin, we're gonna use that, the Gulf one's called the Flexman, which is gonna make the head really flexible even after it's cured, which I think is really good. I've been using that more and more nowadays, because when the pike attacks it becomes really, really chewed, it's still there, and together with the stick on ice, it works really, really well. And then I'm just going to show you a quick one, because there's so many videos nowadays which we have done where I'm doing these smaller bait fish where we have a different kind of bellies to them. But I'm just going to do a quick jig fly here where we're going to put an orange trigger point underneath here like a gill, and then kind of finish out with a small one. So you can see all three different variations. Of course, there's so much more to learn here, but this is kind of just to learn how to make nice, really cool heads. And as you can see, we have a micro lens, an expensive micro lens. Robert says it is, at least. We have a light, so it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different setup from our normal studio lights here, but we want to show you this in really, really close by, because it's small tricks that we have learned, or at least I've learned during a lot of flies, which makes a big difference. So you want to see this up close, and of course you're going to see my mistakes up close too. So let's hope I don't do any of those. So check it out. It's going to be a pretty chewy one here. So here we have just a simple pike streamer I threw together. It's bucktail, flash woo, out. So it's a very simple fly, but it's more to show you how we're going to do with the head here. So this hair clamp is a really good thing. Also having a glass of water, so you can moisture your finger and comb all these thin fibers away, is a really, really good tip, because otherwise you have a tendency to pick them up. So we're going to start with the thin man. And now we have quite a lot of space here, so we could actually have used even thicker viscosity, but now I told you to use the thin man and the classic, so we're going to stick with that. So what we want to do here is we want to fill this gap here, the first one, with thin man, just to get, because I want to make really strong heads. You know, this is supposed to last for a bunch of big fish. So I put it in there. You see, I cover all the thread base and everything like that. Can push this up a little bit so we don't get too of a straight head, and then we're going to cure it. A good thing when you're using the UV resin, so don't put it on the table standing again like this. That I have a tendency to try to hold it in a horizontal way, or put it flat onto the table so we don't put air inside of the bottle. So we have done that. And just to make this a little bit more fancy here, I'm going to run a red belly to it. So I always like to put red first, and then I coat it with a thin man layer, because the red one I like to put a little bit depth to it, a little bit more contrast with it. So by using clear over the red, it just becomes so much nicer. And the good thing with UV resin compared to epoxy is that you basically have all the time in the world. I mean, you can put it here, take a coffee, come back and continue with it, because you don't have any stress at all. So we have basically filled up that gap with ambulance red. So it's really cool. It is, as you can see, extremely fluorescent also. So you get that really nice color and trigger point, you know, on a lot of the flies. So what you have to think about when you're working with the resins that are colored, that there is a little bit harder for the light to go through the resin. So give a little bit longer time with the UV lamp. You are gonna have a better result after that. So and then we're gonna put a thin layer of thin man just over this, just to get that nice depth to it. Onto the table and cure it. So now basically the eyes are secured, and we want to have this. We want to start building this head up now. What we have to think about when we are in this point here, when we have the eyes quite up ahead, of the material. So we don't want to have two eyes here and then coming the rest of the fly here. So we need to kind of also build up the space here. We want to kind of build up a little bit shoulders here, so we get that nice transit up into the fly. So what we're going to do is we're going to start using classic now. So I'm going to push these over here. And the classic one is a little bit, I would say it's much fatter, much thicker viscosity than the Thin Man. So if you want to do a little bit bigger flies and more bulkiness and stuff like that, classic is really the way to go. And you don't have to have these micro tips on those, because sometimes it's better to have that normal tip that comes with different tips. But this is really good if you want to push it into different areas here. So what we want to do now, and it's in my opinion one of the most crucial thing, and a lot of people are making a mistake, is that we want to kind of go on this edge of the eye here and kind of put a thin layer around here. So we have glue or resin from here all the way along the side of the eye and touching this here. So we kind of like make it as a cement, so that there's nothing else, there's no resin who can kind of work itself up into the material you have tied up. If you're working with different materials, it has a tendency to kind of suck it up. So what we want to do now is we want to put a layer here. And that is something I prefer to do with classic, actually, because it doesn't go up into the material in the same way as the Thin Man is doing, because it's just so thin. So we give that a push. So now you can see that we have everything covered here all along the side of the eye here. So this is actually stuck now and meeting this side. So we're going to continue doing exactly the same on the other side. Just get a little bit of water there. So we're doing this again. So we're working around the edge of the eye. So it's basically like 1 millimeter or half a millimeter into the eye and half a millimeter outside the eye. And you get that really nice, secure head. So now we have basically done all the things that are crucial to building up the head. We have done the coverage around here, and we have built up the head. So now we're just going to start to shaping the head so it looks like we want it to. And sometimes it can be a little bit tricky. You just have to go layer by layer or something like that. So what we first want to do is I want to angle the vise slightly upwards, just so the glue doesn't go to the hook eye. I want to kind of leaning against the material. So I want to start building it up here onto the material on the top here. You have to be a little bit patient when you're doing this, because we want to kind of create that nice shape. Of course, you can just throw on a layer here. Just one layer over this and you're good to go. But it should be a UV resin school, so we have to kind of try to make a little bit nicer looking head here. So I'm going to go twice on top here, just to build up that little bit nice shoulder here to the material. And then we're going to do the same thing on the belly here, just to get a nice transit into the rest of the material here. So you can see that. So of course you can spend an hour doing a head like this, and that's not the whole idea here, but I really want to talk you through all the kind of things what I'm doing, so you really can see, and then you can play around how long you ever want to do with your heads, So now we have kind of a nice flow from the head all the way up to into the material here. So I'm just going to push that forward a little bit. So now we're going to basically fill this gap here, so we come up in the same level as the previous one in the back there. We can actually do the belly side too, because it's the viscosity is quite thick. So we slowly rotate the fly when we're doing this. So now we can, here you can go thin resin if you want to, and put layer after layer after layer. I'm going to do most likely 2 layers of classic to build this head up really nice. It could be also be, depending on, it's not really a book you can always write that it's going to be 1 layer or 2 layers. You kind of like have to wing it a little bit depending on how everything turns out. But I'm definitely going to do 1 thick layer of classic, and then we'll see if we're going to do 1 thick layer again, or 1 thinner layer of classic, or a thicker layer of classic again, depending a little bit on what we're going to do here. So we're just going to do a little bit more shoulder on the back here because I'm a little bit allergic to flies that looks like the eyes are kind of in front of the fly. It's, I don't know, one of those ticks. So now basically I'm pretty happy with that. So now we're going to start pushing UV resin on the whole head here. So we're going to start covering the eyes. We're going to go over all the places which I've already put UV resin before. Then you know there's not going to be any surprises, that the resin is going to kind of go down in the material and kind of disappear. And if you're doing this very carefully, you might need to kind of rotate it a little bit, because the resin is going to kind of move into one side. But you have actually more time than you think. So just work slowly and nice here, trying to get it over the whole head in a different way. Maybe not in a different way, in a nice way. So I'm trying to get that. And then just constantly rotating it a little bit. Here you can angle your vise if you want to have more resin coming closer to the hook eye. You can angle a little bit downwards, or if you want it to come a little bit more up in the fly, you just lean it so the resin can go backwards. But I'm pretty happy with that. It's kind of crystal clear head. Just rotate it slowly. Make sure you cure all the angles to it. The cool thing when you have a really well charged UV lamp, you can actually see the smoke coming out from the UV resin. So I think that's fairly good. You know, now you realize that those thread wraps should really have colored those with a marker, but the only one who's going to see it is you and me, so it's not a big thing. But here we're going to have a stone hard head, which is going to be extremely durable, and I think it's a very simple and way to do it. You know, we're going to have this nice color contrast, kind of a trigger point on the belly here, and we're going to have the eyes secured, like baked into the head here. So a simple, crystal clear, stone hard, non-tack head. And it's a 15-minute fly and a 15-meter head. So this is the one if you want to have it, make it stone hard. Of course, we can kind of work, so this gap between the head here and into the material, we can, of course, if we want to be very picky, we can put another layer around here, but we're not going to do that because we're going to do 2 different heads to add to this one. So that's the first one. So we've been using Thin Man and Classic, and now we're going to use basically Thin Man and a little bit of the Ambulance into, no, we're actually going to do the Flex Man first. So simple fly with a nice head onto it. So onto the next fly. So the next fly we are going to do one of these kind of like a bottom bowser fly. Normally I put a hard head to this, but I did that to the previous fly, so we're going to do a soft head to this. And the material underneath here is tightened up, so it's a quite thin fiber, and it has a little bit of flash inside, a ripple ice inside of it. So you have to be a little bit careful, because it has a tendency to, if you're using the thin man and those really thin viscosities, it has a tendency to kind of suck up the UV resin. So you have to be a little bit careful with this. But now we're going to use the flex man, which doesn't really have the same effect. It's a little bit thicker one. But the cool thing with that is when it's already done, when the head is done and everything, you're happy with everything, it's still going to be soft, so you can compress it and you can, you know, step on it or drive a car over it, whatever you want to do, fly a plane over it. It's going to be okay. So these small hair clamps are really good help when you're doing this with pike fly. I have a tendency to kind of go back with them and then push it up a little bit, depending on what type of head shape I want to have on the fly. So we're going to use the Gulf Flexman. We have already put 2 of these predator, or these angry eyes, sorry about that, so angry eyes from Paolo Paccarini here in Italy. So they are a little bit different shape to the stick-on eyes compared to the normal round ones. But the good thing with all these stick-on eyes, and especially these eyes, that he has actually used a very soft material. So instead of some of the other ones, the different brands can be a little bit a little bit hard. So these are really following the shape in a really nice way. And they're also very, very fluorescent, which is good when you have these other colors. So first, I like to pull this quite tight when I put the first layer here, because what I'm going to do now is basically, you want to move this, not the pencil, but the tip of the resin here. You want to move it from the hook eye and towards the end, because if you go the opposite direction, there's a lot of chance that you start picking materials up, which you don't want to do. So you want to stroke it in the direction of the end of the fly. So first we are going to basically paint with this the gap, a thin layer kind of around the head here, just to kind of determine the head shape, and also kind of get that UV resin into the material a little bit. So here you basically want to like just make sure that you have basically the head shape you want to have. This is just a thin layer. I'm pretty happy with that. You can a little bit play around here. You can lift, or you can do whatever you want to. As I said, you have all the time in the world. You can actually pull some of that into the material. And then I'm going to hit the lamp to cure this all around. So now this is a soft one, so it's not going to be a stone hard head. It's going to keep being soft the whole time. So usually I do this first layer, and then I do 2 coats over that, just to make sure that it's really nice and strong. So the first one is usually basically to cover the gap in between there, as you can see. So we're just going to cure that. And the cool thing with this, I had some flies that I've caught like, I don't know, 50, 60 pike, and everything is still, you know, holding together, even if that you've hit the boat or hit something on a stone or a log or something. They've been really heavily chewed, and but the head is still intact and everything is fine. So I think these Flexman and these softer viscosities are really a good way to go in a lot of pike flies. So now you see, now I've done the belly side. I've gone a little bit over the eyes. So I'm basically just going to hit this with the UV lamp here. And of course, when you're working with UV resin, and the same thing as when we were using epoxy in the past, you know, the more you use it, the better you get at it. And take your time, you know, there's no rush, and learn how to use the material. So now I'm going to angle this up a little bit more here, because now I'm going to cover basically, as you can see, the whole head is covered now, but I haven't really covered the face of the eyes here. So now I'm going to put that basically final coat here, which is going to be slightly heavier, so it's going to be a little bit more here, so I have to be a little bit careful so I don't drop in my knee here. A good thing is to have something in your knee when you're doing this, because in the beginning it's quite easy to take a little bit too much resin, or you don't know how much time you have. So it's basically good to be a little bit careful. So now this is the third coat here basically. And now I have, in my opinion, a nice and a head that is covered all around it. The eyes are basically completely sealed into this. And by doing 3 layers instead of just one really thick one, you're going to have a much stronger head, and it's going to be so much more durable than just doing 1 or 2 layer, or even just 1 layer for that case. So now you can see here I just came slightly, and this is kind of a mistake from my side. I just came with the UV resin slightly over where I was supposed to go, and you can see it just goes straight up to the material. That's why it's so important to seal that whole material before you start working with thicker layers, you know. So slightly, I'm not really happy with that, but of course it doesn't make any difference at all, and the pike is not going to care at all. But you know, I try to get that nice edge to it. So here we have a soft head, which is going to be, as you can see, now it's still a little bit warm, so it's still curing a little bit, so don't push this too hard. But as you can see, it's going to be soft like this, and it's going to stay like this for the rest of this fly's life. It's cool to have these resins that are flexible, but still gives that really tack-free and really clear and nice coat. So it's really good. And also it's good to have it a little bit flexible, because you will not really kill that hook gape in the same way as if you have a hard head. So this is working with Flexman, and you know, we're covering quite a big eyes here, but it looks, in my opinion, really nice. And what I like also is you can see, depending on what type of material, but here we have some electric, when I wet this down, you can see it a little bit like this tighten dubbing here. When it gets wet, it gets a little bit translucent, and you have this just fluorescent ripple eyes inside of it, which is just insanely cool. So in my opinion, this is a really good way to do flexible pike heads. So the last one we're going to do is going to be a small jig fly, which is very simple, but I think a lot of you guys are tying those if you're fishing for perch and stuff like that. So we're just going to do a very small head. And if you want to see how you do heads in kind of like a baitfish pattern or stuff like that, we will have like the Titan dubbing baitfish, and there will be numerous of different baitfish here, how to play around with smaller flies. But we're going to end this little bit school kind of video here by pushing out a small jig head. We have a 5.5 millimeter tungsten bead. So this is going to be really a bottom bouncer. So I want to use the ones that it becomes really hard here. So I'm going to use Thin Man. We're going to go do a thin layer of Classic on top of this, and we're also going to, in this little gap here, because it's a slotted tungsten bead, we're going to push some red UV resin into that hole, and also going to continue it out between the eyes just to get that nice throat on the fly. So we are putting some water here, so we basically get all these thin predator dubbing fibers away. And we have a tail of Flashabou here. So we're going to start with some ambulance red. As you can see, we have a small hole here, which I would like to get some resin in. When I prepped this before, I actually already filled a small gap on top here. I filled that with clear resin, but this one I want to push some red into. And I don't want that bubble. Let's try to have a bubble-free one here, thank you. So this is, as I said, a really nice contrast. And this is a perch fly here, so they really like that little red point here. So I'm going to hold those fibers down just a little bit like that, and then we're gonna hit that lamp. As you can see now, I've kind of filled this small gap that I had in my tungsten bead here, and I've basically just pushed it all around there. If you want to be super picky, and I'm doing this, so I'm just gonna take these thin fibers that are sticking up here away, because those thin fibers can sometimes interfere quite a lot when you're doing nice heads, if you want to do that perfect finish. So I recommend you to take some of those away if you have those. Now we're going to continue with the thin man here. So we're going to put the first layer of thin man on top here, in between the eyes, basically covering that whole area we just worked with. And then we're going to flip this around. We're going to hold this fiber down here so we can get that thin resin into this. The cool thing with this is you make really a bulletproof fly here. You know, we basically glue and weld everything together here, which is going to be super strong. And when you're hitting this on the bottom and jumping around like that, there's basically nothing that's going to break at all. You know. So now we have done this. You see we have this thin resin in the bottom, and we have this here. So I'm just going to angle the vise slightly towards the ground a little bit here, because when I want to do this side here with the eyes, I just want to have that the material are not really flowing into the dubbing, or the resin is flowing into the dubbing. It's going a little bit downwards, as you can see there. So I have a little bit extra time to show you guys before I cure it. So you see, we just like we did in the previous, the first pike fly there, we basically just made a small resin, kind of a small section between the eye and the dubbing. So now everything is secured here, everything is strong. I want to angle that vise so it's straight again. And here, of course, now we have already so much resin onto this, so I don't want to build up too much thickness here. I basically only want to do a clear coat over this, and we're done. So I'm going to continue with the same resin. If you want to basically build up a little bit more chunky head, you could go to a thicker viscosity, or just go 2 layers. But we're just going to do 1 thin layer here with thin man, and we're going to call it done. So I'm just going to angle this a little bit backwards here, so everything flows together nicely here. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm just going to angle it slightly downwards. I'm going to rotate this while we start curing this. So now we have basically glued everything together, so we have secured that head, the tungsten head, towards the material and everything like that. So we have a super solid thread base, all the materials are glued in, and it's just a super simple killer jig fly, which it can stand numerous of beating and probably at least 100 perch. So that's my take on some different UV resins, different viscosities, also different type of flies and what you can do with it. We most likely are going to do maybe a second school with a little bit more advanced stuff in the future, but this is the basics, so you can do very cool heads on different type of patterns. And if you haven't tried UV resin, please do, because it's really good. Try out the Gulf stuff, it's excellent stuff. There's no more tacky UV resins, they're all perfectly, and it holds what it promises. tie some fly, make some heads, and well, have a great time at the vise.